Have you ever noticed how often you explain yourself, even when nobody asked? Why you're tired, why you stayed home, why you chose peace instead of chaos. Each explanation feels small, harmless, even polite. But when you step back, you realize you've been living as if your very existence requires footnotes, as though every breath, every decision must be justified to an invisible audience. And it is exhausting. It's like carrying a backpack that no one sees, yet you feel its weight every hour of the day. Each explanation you give is another stone dropped into that pack. I'm sorry I didn't show up. I'm sorry I'm not enough. I'm sorry I don't fit in. The longer you carry it, the heavier it becomes. And before long, you're not walking freely anymore. You're trudging, bowed under the invisible weight of apology. Where does this compulsion come from? It's not born from nowhere. It's learned, quietly, almost secretly, as we grow. From childhood, many of us were taught the art of pleasing, to soften our edges so we wouldn't disturb, to shape ourselves so we'd be accepted. We were told, be quiet, don't embarrass us, act proper, behave. Each phrase planted a seed of doubt. Maybe who I am is not enough. Maybe if I don't explain myself, I'll be rejected, or worse, abandoned. That's the wound at the root of over-explaining. Not a quirk, but a survival strategy. It was once the armor that helped you navigate a world that punished rawness and rewarded masks. Children don't know how to rationalize rejection. They simply adapt. They learn to say, if I can explain myself well enough, maybe I'll be safe. Maybe they'll stay. And so begins a lifelong performance, where your voice is not a melody, but a defense. Imagine this, a child in a schoolyard who doesn't want to play the same games as the others. Instead of being left in peace, the child is pressed. Why aren't you joining? And if the answer doesn't satisfy, rejection comes. That child quickly learns. Feelings must be translated into explanations. I'm not playing because I'm tired. Not, I simply don't feel like it. Even at that young age, the authentic voice is silenced, reshaped into something acceptable, and society rewards this. In many cultures, conformity is survival. To stand out, to say no without reasons, is dangerous. History is full of examples where individuality was punished, from villages where outcasts were exiled to kingdoms where dissent was silenced. Humanity learned that to belong, one must mold, explain, justify. That lesson is ancient, echoing still in our lives today. Yet what no one tells you is this: the more you explain yourself, the further you drift from yourself. Words meant to protect become chains that bind. Your voice, instead of being the bridge between your inner world and the outer one, becomes a courtroom speech, rehearsed and defensive. And in that courtroom, you play every role: the accused, the lawyer, the judge. You stand trial for being human. But here's the truth that slowly surfaces in the silence between explanations. Not everyone needs to understand you. And no matter how perfectly you craft your reasons, those unwilling to see you never will. Over-explaining doesn't create connection. It creates distance because every word becomes a plea for permission rather than a song of expression. Still, the fear of being misunderstood runs deep. It whispers that without explanation, love will vanish, people will turn away, the ground beneath you will crumble. And so you explain. You justify. You plead. All the while forgetting that existing, simply existing, requires no permission slip. This is the invisible burden. This is the quiet trial of your soul. And perhaps the heaviest part of all is that you've carried it so long, you barely notice the weight anymore. It feels normal, natural, like the air you breathe. But it isn't. It's learned. And what is learned can be unlearned. Because there comes a moment, small but powerful, when something inside whispers, enough. Enough of translating yourself so others can feel comfortable. Enough of handing out explanations like currency. Enough of begging for acceptance in the form of reasons. And in that moment, when the whisper becomes a roar inside your chest, the first crack of liberation begins. Not through noise, not through arguments, but through silence. The silence of dignity. The silence that says, I do not need to convince you of my truth anymore. If you look closely at this need to explain yourself, you'll see it isn't just a habit. It's a wound stitched deep into childhood. Children don't enter the world with explanations on their lips. They cry, they laugh, they say no with raw honesty. But somewhere along the way, a shift happens. They discover that certain truths bring disapproval, silence, or even abandonment. And so they learn a painful lesson. Honesty without justification is dangerous. Think back to your earliest memories. Perhaps you said, I'm sad, and were told, don't be dramatic. Maybe you said, I don't want to, and were scolded, don't be ungrateful. Or you cried, and instead of being held, you heard, stop crying, you're fine. These words, seemingly small, plant seeds in the heart of a child. Seeds that whisper, my feelings are not valid unless they're explained in a way others accept. Psychologists call this emotional memory, impressions left so deeply in childhood that they echo throughout adulthood. Every time you explain yourself now, you're not just speaking to the present. You're echoing that child, standing small in front of authority, trying to avoid rejection. You're still on that playground, or in that living room, explaining why you're tired, why you're distant, why you're different, as if the alternative is exile. And it is exile, not physical, but emotional. For a child, the threat of being misunderstood feels like being cast out into the cold. Human beings are wired for connection. We survive through belonging. So when a child fears rejection, their nervous system treats it like danger. Their heartbeat quickens, their body tenses, their mind races to defend. That survival instinct, to explain, to justify, to smooth the edges of self, becomes second nature. This is why so many adults today feel like they're walking through life on a minefield. Every word is monitored, every gesture carefully placed, as though one wrong step will trigger abandonment. This constant vigilance leaves little room for authenticity. Instead of speaking to express, you speak to defend. Instead of sharing, you persuade. And history reinforces this lesson. Across centuries, societies have trained children in conformity. Ancient Sparta, for instance, demanded that boys suppress weakness. Their cries were shamed, their doubts punished. In Confucian traditions, obedience to family often came before self-expression. In countless villages, towns, and empires, the child who asked too many questions or resisted tradition was seen as a threat. Survival meant silence, or at least carefully crafted speech. And so, generation after generation, the art of over-explaining was passed down like an heirloom, a language of fear disguised as politeness. But what does that do to the soul? Over time, that creeping vine of doubt grows thicker. You stop asking, what do I feel? Instead, you ask, how can I explain this so they won't be upset? Your life becomes less about living and more about performing. The child inside you still fears exile, and so you carry that fear into every room, every relationship, every decision. And here lies the tragedy. The people around you might never demand explanations, but the child within insists on giving them anyway. It's as if that younger self still trembles, whispering, if I don't explain myself well enough, I'll lose love. I'll be left alone. Yet deep inside, another whisper begins to stir. A different memory, one not of fear, but of truth. Because before the lessons, before the shame, there was a time you spoke freely. That child still exists. That voice still lives within you, waiting beneath the layers of apology. The path of healing begins when you recognize this wound for what it is. Not weakness, not failure, but survival. You learn to over-explain because you wanted love, because you longed to stay connected, because at the deepest level you were protecting yourself. But protection can become a prison. And when you begin to see that, when you realize that the voice of explanation is really the voice of fear learned long ago, something powerful happens. You awaken to the possibility that you no longer need to live by that old script. Because while exile is terrifying for a child, you are no longer that child. You are stronger now, wiser now, and slowly you can begin to loosen the grip of those old emotional memories. Not by silencing them, but by meeting them with compassion, by saying to that younger self, "I hear you, I believe you, but we are safe now. We no longer need to explain to survive." By the time we reach adulthood, the habit of explaining ourselves is no longer just something we do. It becomes something we wear. Like a mask, carefully sculpted over years, it clings to the face until we can hardly tell where the mask ends and where our skin begins. We justify not just our choices, but our very existence. We don't say, "This is who I am." Instead, we say, "This is who I am. And here's why you shouldn't leave me for it." Every explanation is another stitch in that mask. "I'm not angry, I'm just tired. I didn't mean to upset you. I just thought, I don't need help, I just don't want to be a burden." Each phrase smooths the surface, hides the raw truth beneath. On the outside, the mask looks polite, agreeable, even admirable, but on the inside, it tightens, it suffocates. We tell ourselves this mask is protection, and in a way it is. A shield against judgment, a barrier against rejection. But protection, worn too long, becomes confinement. The mask doesn't just hide our vulnerability from others, it hides it from ourselves. One day you wake up and realize you haven't spoken your true thoughts in years. You haven't allowed yourself to be misunderstood or disliked or simply unfiltered. You've spoken only what fits the role the mask was designed to play. History is full of masks, both literal and symbolic. In ancient theater, masks allowed actors to adopt roles that weren't their own. In tribal rituals, masks channeled spirits, gods, or ancestors. They were tools of transformation. But what happens when the mask isn't removed at the end of the ritual? What happens when the role you play becomes the person you believe yourself to be? That's when the mask no longer serves you. You serve the mask. And this is what over-explaining does. You no longer speak because you want to be known. You speak because you want to be safe. Your words stop being an expression and become a defense. They're not songs. They're court testimonies. Each one a plea to the invisible jury of others. Please believe me. Please don't abandon me. Please let me stay. But here's the terrible irony. The more you wear the mask, the less anyone can see you. They see the justifications, the rehearsed phrases, the politeness polished to perfection. They don't see your real thoughts, your raw emotions, your untidy humanity. And isn't that what you wanted all along? To be seen? To be accepted for who you really are? Yet the very strategy meant to protect you ends up hiding the truth of you from everyone, including yourself. It's like living in a prison whose bars are invisible but unbreakable. On the outside, people may praise you for being considerate, articulate, agreeable. On the inside, you're gasping for air. Each justification tightens like a rope, squeezing authenticity out of your lungs. And still, you keep smiling. Still, you keep explaining. Because the mask whispers, "If you take me off, they'll leave you." But masks, no matter how beautifully made, always begin to crack. The edges fray. The weight becomes unbearable. And in a quiet moment, maybe while you're alone at night, maybe in the middle of a conversation when you realize you've just explained something you didn't need to. You feel it. That longing to breathe without defense, to exist without justification. And that longing is not weakness. It is the soul's rebellion. It is the whisper of truth beneath the mask saying, "Let me out." Because you were never meant to live behind explanations. You were meant to live as yourself, raw, imperfect, real. And the moment you begin to recognize the mask for what it is, survival, not identity, is the moment you begin to remember who you were before the mask was ever placed on your face. At first glance, silence can feel like emptiness, a void, a punishment. For many of us, silence was the sharp edge of rejection in childhood, the cold treatment of parents, the absence of comfort, the heavy air after conflict. That kind of silence wounds. It teaches us that without words, we are abandoned. And so we grow into adults who cling to explanations, filling the air with reasons, apologies, and justifications, terrified that silence will cost us love. But silence is not one thing. It is many. It can be a prison, yes, but it can also be a sanctuary. The difference lies in intention. Silence imposed by fear suffocates. Silence chosen with dignity liberates. One silences your truth. The other shelters it. Consider the ancient traditions that revered silence not as absence, but as presence. In Zen Buddhism, silence is not emptiness, but awakening, the stillness in which the mind finally hears itself. In Christian monastic orders, silence was a discipline, a way to draw closer to God without distraction. Among many indigenous cultures, silence was respect, a way of honoring the wisdom of elders, the cycles of nature, the sacred rhythm of life. To sit in silence was not weakness, it was reverence, yet our modern world mistrusts silence. In conversation, a pause feels awkward. In relationships, silence feels threatening. On social media, silence is read as disapproval. We are taught to fill every gap with words, explanations, chatter, but in doing so, we rob ourselves of the medicine silence can carry. Because sometimes silence is not avoidance. It is the first act of self-respect. When you choose not to explain yourself, not to defend your every feeling, you are not withdrawing from life. You are stepping back into your own center. You are saying, "I no longer need to convince you of my truth." And in that refusal, there is a quiet but unshakable power. Think of it like this. Words can be weapons, but silence can be a shield. Words can be chains, but silence can be release. Not the silence that begs to be broken, but the silence that simply is, steady, whole, untouchable. That silence doesn't erase you. It amplifies you. In it, you begin to hear yourself again. The paradox is that the same silence which once wounded you can also heal you. The same absence that once felt like exile can, when chosen, become a homecoming. That is the turning point, when you reclaim silence not as something done to you, but as something you choose for yourself. Imagine for a moment sitting in a quiet room, no explanations ready on your tongue, no performance waiting in your throat, just the rise and fall of your breath, the soft weight of your own presence. There is no one to convince, no one to appease. And in that stillness, you feel it, the lightness of simply existing, without reason, without defense. It's in that space that you begin to realize silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes silence is a boundary. Sometimes silence is a declaration louder than words. Sometimes silence is the soul finally saying, "Enough." Not all words are equal. Some rise from a place of love, carrying the warmth of truth, calm and steady like a flame that doesn't flicker. Others spill out of fear, fragile, hurried, trembling under the weight of doubt. And when you've lived your life explaining yourself, you begin to know the difference not just in your mind, but in your body. You feel it in your throat, in your stomach, in the heaviness in your chest. Speaking from fear is like standing trial every day. Imagine yourself in a courtroom where the judge, jury, and prosecutor are all you. Each word becomes evidence, each explanation a defense plea. You aren't speaking to share, you're speaking to survive. And at the end of it, even when the verdict is kind, you feel hollow. Because fear never nourishes, it only drains. Speaking from love, on the other hand, feels altogether different. It doesn't rush, it doesn't beg, it doesn't shrink itself into tidy sentences to please an audience. It flows slowly, clearly, because it has nothing to prove. Love doesn't need to convince. It simply is. And when words come from that place, they don't deplete you. They strengthen you. But for many, speaking from love feels foreign, almost dangerous. After years of training, the instinct to justify overshadows everything else. You say no and immediately scramble for reasons. You express a boundary and feel compelled to soften it with apologies. You make a choice for yourself and then spend hours explaining it to others as though their approval is the final stamp that makes your decision real. Why do we do this? Because somewhere deep inside, we believe silence without justification will cost us love. We think if we don't explain, people will assume the worst. If we don't defend, they'll walk away. And so, instead of speaking from the still center of love, we speak from the frantic edges of fear. But fear-based speaking is a prison. It leaves you exhausted, your voice trembling, your soul depleted. Each sentence crafted to avoid rejection slowly chips away at your authenticity. It is like trying to stop a storm with your bare hands, desperate, futile, and endlessly tiring. There are moments in history that remind us of this divide. Think of leaders, visionaries, or artists who spoke from love. Their words carried weight not because they were flawless, but because they were true. And think of the countless ordinary people silenced by fear, explaining themselves into oblivion, their truths lost beneath layers of apology. One voice shakes the world, the other disappears into echoes. When you notice the difference in your own life, it is startling. You realize that for years you haven't been speaking to express your soul. You've been speaking to protect it. And while protection was once necessary, it has kept you from the very connection you've been longing for. Because here's the paradox. The people who truly want to see you don't need explanations. They don't need you to rehearse your truth in a way that makes it palatable. They feel you. They sense you. They accept without footnotes. It is only those unwilling to understand who demand endless explanations. And no matter how perfectly you craft your reasons, they will never be satisfied, not because of who you are now, but because they never chose to see you from the beginning. And so, the shift begins. The recognition that not every word must be spoken, not every decision must be explained. You start to experiment with silence, not silence of fear, but silence of love. And in that silence, you discover something revolutionary. Your truth doesn't need defense. It simply exists, steady, whole, undeniable. There comes a day, often quiet, almost unremarkable, when something inside you shifts. After years of bending, attuing, apologizing, explaining, you feel it, the bone-deep exhaustion of living as though your worth is always on trial. And in that moment, you hear a truth that once terrified you, but now feels liberating. You have the right to exist without permission. Choosing yourself is not an act of arrogance. It is not selfishness. It is survival. Emotional survival. Yet because we are raised in cultures that glorify sacrifice, politeness, and compliance, putting yourself first feels like betrayal. You were taught to smile even when you're breaking, to yield even when you're hurting, to place the comfort of others above your own peace. And when you finally say no without softening it, the world trembles. People will notice. Some will leave. Others will get angry. They'll call you distant, cold, ungrateful. Why? Because you are no longer the version of yourself they built for their convenience. You are no longer the endless giver, the tireless explainer, the compliant presence. And that to them feels like loss. But to you it feels like liberation. Yes, it hurts to be misunderstood. Yes, it stings to be left behind. But those who walk away when you stop performing were never really staying for you. They were staying for the role you played. And when the mask falls, when you choose yourself, they see someone unfamiliar. Some will leave. But those who truly care, those who see beyond explanation, will stay. History is full of such moments of rupture. Think of the women who refused to remain silent in societies that demanded obedience. Think of the writers, the thinkers, the exiles who chose truth over conformity, even at great cost. Their decision to choose themselves wasn't just rebellion. It was an act of preservation, a refusal to vanish into the mold others had prepared for them. And though your battle may not be written in history books, it is no less sacred. The day you stop over-explaining, the day you say, "This is my boundary," without justification, is the day you reclaim your life. It is the day you step out of the courtroom of constant defense and walk into the open field of your own dignity. But let's not pretend it is easy. The first time you put yourself first, something inside you trembles. The old wound whispers, "They'll abandon you." The child within panics, desperate to reach for explanation. And yet you resist. You sit in the discomfort of being misunderstood. You allow the silence to hold. And you realize the world does not collapse. You are still here. You are still whole. That realization is the beginning of freedom. Because every time you choose yourself without guilt, the chains of old conditioning loosen. Every time you say no without apology, you bury the compulsion to justify. And with each step, you grow lighter, stronger, more at home in your own skin. Choosing yourself may feel lonely at first, but it is not the loneliness of abandonment. It is the solitude of rebirth. A sacred solitude where you rebuild your identity not as others demanded it, but as you truly are. In that quiet space, you remember, your worth was never up for negotiation. And when you stand before the mirror, no longer rehearsing explanations, no longer pleading for acceptance, you see someone you had nearly forgotten. Someone strong, someone whole, someone who no longer needs to beg to be chosen because they have already chosen themselves. Not all silence heals. Some silence is a sanctuary, but some is a cage, and many of us, without realizing it, have lived in the latter. It is the silence of fear, the kind that knots in your throat, presses against your chest, and convinces you that speaking your truth will only bring rejection or conflict. You know this silence well. It's the silence that follows after someone dismisses your feelings. You're overreacting. It's the silence that grows after your vulnerability is mocked, after your tears are labeled weakness. Slowly, you begin to swallow your words. You tell yourself it's easier this way, safer. You become skilled at smiling when you want to scream, at saying, "I'm fine," when your entire body aches with unshed truths. At first, this silence feels protective. Why open your heart if it will only be dismissed? Why speak if your words will only be turned against you? Better to stay quiet. Better to bury it all. But over time, the silence tightens like a rope wound too many times around your throat. What once shielded you now strangles you. This kind of silence doesn't give you peace. It wages war inside you. Your mind becomes a battlefield where unsaid words clash with unacknowledged feelings. Your body becomes the graveyard of emotions that never found release. Stress lingers in your muscles, anger burns in your stomach, sadness pools in your chest. And you wake up each day wondering why you feel so tired, even though you've said so little. Psychologists have long known that suppressed emotions don't vanish. They resurface. Sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as depression, sometimes as physical illness. The body remembers what the mouth refuses to say. And so the silence that was meant to protect you begins to break you from within. History shows us this too. In every era, oppressed people silenced by fear carried invisible scars. The poet whose voice was banned wrote in secret, their unspoken words eating away at them. The dissenter who stayed quiet for survival lived with an unhealed wound of truth denied. Across cultures, we see it. Silence forced by fear corrodes the soul, even when it keeps the body safe. And yet, here is the cruel trick. After a while, this prison silence feels normal. You forget there was ever another way. You convince yourself that peace is pretending, that calm is compliance, that self-erasure is love. You forget the sound of your own voice when it wasn't trembling. You forget what it feels like to speak without apology. But somewhere deep inside, your soul remembers. It remembers the laughter that burst out before shame taught you to swallow it. It remembers the truth you wanted to shout, but never dared. That memory, however faint, is the key. Because the silence that destroys and the silence that heals are not the same. One is built on fear, the other is born of intention. The prison silence says, "I'm not worthy of being heard." The healing silence says, "I am so worthy I no longer need to explain." One shrinks you, the other restores you. And this is the difference you must begin to notice. Because until you do, you will keep mistaking suffocation for safety. You will keep mistaking suppression for strength. And your soul, weary from carrying words unsaid, will keep whispering in the dark, "There must be another way." Your truth is not cheap. It is not something to be handed out like coins tossed into the street. Yet when you live with the fear of being unseen, you may scatter it recklessly, explaining yourself to anyone who questions, offering your deepest confessions to those who haven't earned the right to hear them. And each time your vulnerability is met with judgment, indifference, or mockery, something inside you withdraws a little further. This is why over-explaining hurts so much. It is not just about words. It is about exposing your truth to the wrong hands. Your wounds, your feelings, your boundaries, they are sacred, like fire. And fire, depending on where it is placed, can illuminate or destroy. In safe hands, it warms and protects. In careless hands, it burns. History offers us powerful metaphors for this. In ancient temples, sacred objects were never shown to everyone. They were hidden behind veils, guarded by priests, revealed only to the worthy. In mythology, sacred knowledge was given only to initiates, those prepared to honor it. Even in folklore, secrets carried by healers or shamans were passed down carefully because the truth in unworthy hands could be twisted into harm. So why then do we treat our own truth as though it needs to be available to all? Why do we spill it in front of people who have shown us no reverence? Perhaps because deep down we still hope. Hope that this time someone will listen, someone will stay, someone will prove we are not too much to love. And so we explain, again and again, until our words feel like blood leaving our body. But not everyone deserves your voice. Not everyone deserves your silence either. Both are gifts. And learning the difference, learning who can hold your truth and who cannot, is one of the deepest acts of self-love you will ever practice. Because the problem isn't that you trusted. The problem isn't that you spoke. The pain came from not recognizing the ones who were never worthy of hearing you in the first place. And that is not your fault. You were seeking connection. You were seeking safety. You were seeking what every soul longs for, to be seen and understood. Yet your truth is not a performance. It is not an argument to be won, not a product to be approved. It is a flame, and flames demand respect. If someone dismisses it, mocks it, or twists it, that is not a reflection of your weakness, but of their inability to receive. And so you begin to choose differently. You begin to treat your truth like the sacred thing it is. You do not silence it forever, but you do not offer it everywhere. You learn to say, "My story isn't for just anyone. It's for those who know how to honor it." This shift is profound. Because when you stop scattering your truth into unworthy spaces, you conserve your energy. You no longer bleed words into voids. Instead, you guard them until the moment feels right, until the person before you has proven they can hold them tenderly. And when that happens, something beautiful occurs. Your voice no longer trembles. Your silence no longer suffocates. Your truth no longer feels like begging. It feels like belonging. Your truth is sacred. And when you finally honor it as such, you realize explaining yourself is not the only way to be understood. Sometimes, the deepest understanding requires no explanation at all. There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that no sleep can cure. It comes not from the body, but from the soul, from years spent pleading for acceptance through words. Every explanation you've ever given in fear was not just a sentence. It was a kind of begging. Please don't misunderstand me. Please don't leave. Please see me as enough. And though you may not have spoken those pleas out loud, they lived in every syllable you uttered. This cycle of begging is insidious because it doesn't look like desperation at first. It looks like patience. It looks like compromise. It looks like kindness. You smile when you want to cry. You nod when you want to resist. You explain. Until your voice goes hoarse, believing that if you just find the right words, they will finally see you. But in truth, what you are really saying is, "I will bend until you love me," and bending, over time, breaks you. The tragedy is not that others fail to see you. The tragedy is how much of yourself you surrendered in the hope that they would. How many pieces you gave away. How many truths you buried. How many boundaries you softened until they dissolved altogether. But there comes a day when the soul can no longer kneel. A day when, after one explanation too many, something inside you whispers, "No more." It isn't shouted in anger. It isn't a roar of defiance. It is calm, steady, final. The begging stops, not because you no longer crave love, but because you finally recognize that love which requires you to beg was never love at all. This is not an easy shift. It feels, at first, like walking away from safety. For so long, your survival strategy was to explain, to appease, to soften yourself for acceptance. To stop begging feels like stepping into the unknown. What if they leave? What if you are alone? What if silence means exile? But then something surprising happens. You discover that the solitude that follows is not a punishment, but a cleansing. You realize you are not abandoned. You are free. Free from the courtroom of constant defense. Free from the exhausting dance of convincing. Free from the cycle of waiting for others to declare you worthy. History remembers countless revolutions that began this way, not with swords, but with refusal. The refusal of the oppressed to beg for rights. The refusal of visionaries to beg for permission. The refusal of the silenced to keep quiet when truth burned within them. Dignity always begins with a no more. And your personal revolution is no different. When you stop begging, you do not harden. You heal. You do not grow cold. You grow whole. You reclaim the pieces of yourself you once traded for crumbs of acceptance. And in that reclamation, you find something that begging never gave you: dignity. Because dignity is not about being understood. It is about knowing that even if no one understands, you are still enough. It is about walking without resentment but with memory, without vengeance but with boundaries. It is about holding your heart not outstretched for approval, but close, finally, to yourself. And once you taste this dignity, you realize there is no going back. The cycle of begging ends not with applause, not with validation, but with a quiet strength that says, "I owe no one an explanation for existing. I am here. I am enough." There comes a moment, almost imperceptible, when the endless noise quiets, not because the world has changed, but because you have. After years of explaining, defending, begging, you step into a silence that feels different from all the rest. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of suffocation, but the silence of return, the silence of coming home to yourself. This silence is not empty. It is full of your breath, your presence, your truth. For the first time in a long time, you hear yourself without interruption. And what you hear is not weakness, not doubt, not apology. It is steady. It is clear. It is the voice of the self you had buried beneath explanations. The self that was always waiting quietly for you to come back. In this silence, you realize something profound. You don't need to be understood to be real. You don't need approval to be worthy. Your existence, your feelings, your choices, they are valid without defense. Some people may never understand you. Some may misinterpret your silence as distance, your boundaries as coldness. But that no longer matters because you know the truth. And truth, when it is real, does not require persuasion. This is what Carl Jung meant when he said, "What you resist persists. What you accept transforms." For years, you resisted misunderstanding, resisted rejection, resisted the possibility of being unloved unless you explained yourself. And so the cycle persisted. But the moment you accepted that not everyone will see you, and that you do not need them to, everything changed. Because in accepting this, you transform. You no longer carry the invisible backpack of apology. You no longer play all the roles in your own trial. You no longer rehearse speeches for an audience that never truly listened. Instead, you walk lighter. You speak less, but your words carry more weight. You explain less, but your presence says more than any argument ever could. And something unexpected happens. As you settle into this silence of self-respect, you begin to attract others who live the same way. People who don't demand explanations. People who feel you rather than interrogate you. People who honor your energy without dissecting it. Soul recognizes soul, and no words are needed. This is freedom, not the loud, dramatic freedom of rebellion, but the quiet, unshakable freedom of belonging to yourself. It is the recognition that you were never here to persuade, never here to perform, never here to justify your place. You were here to live, to feel, to be. And in that sacred silence, you finally understand. You don't need to convince anyone of your worth. You never did. All along, the permission you sought from others was yours to give, and now you have given it. So take a deep breath, close your eyes, rest in the silence that no longer suffocates but heals. You have returned home, not to a place, not to a person, but to yourself. And there is no journey more holy than this.